Hello, it's Anna Beckwith from Yara Consulting here. What I'd like to bring you today is quite a specific issue. How do you take questions with confidence? Now, a number of people have asked me how you actually do that whilst still maintaining your gravitas and your authority as a presenter. Now, a number of factors that influence your ability to do that have already been covered in the 5-minute masterclasses on confidence that I've already posted on YouTube, so have a look at those. The issue at hand is people often feel confident enough when they're giving their presentation, all the materials prepared. They start to feel less comfortable and less confident when they go off-piste and actually you haven't got a clue what the audience is potentially going to ask you. That is where these techniques come into their own. Now, before I share with you 3 specific techniques, the repeat, the deflect and the flannel, techniques that I teach and I sometimes use myself, let me just preface that by saying there's certain things that do need to be in place already before you get to the point when you're actually answering questions from the floor. The first thing is you have to have the right mindset. You have to be convinced in yourself that you are the right person to be on that stage, and you are. You have been placed on that stage to give information, to facilitate whatever it happens to be. You also have to believe in yourself that you know more than your audience does. Now, that can be a tough call. I've found myself numerous times in situations where I'm delivering training or speaking in public to a group of very, very senior managers in various corporate organisations. And when I was working in the corporate environment, I didn't get to that same senior level of management. However, I do know more than them about what I want to say to them. I have very, very thoroughly prepared. So it's important that you bear that in mind. In some context, you do know more than them, and crucially, you have prepared. If you haven't prepared, it's game over. We've all seen speakers fall flat on their faces because they think they can busk it on the day and they can't. It's disrespectful to the audience. Don't put yourself in that position. Make sure your mindset is right. The other 2 things are body language and tone of voice. Oftentimes your body language and tone of voice will give you away big time. Just by way of example, a couple of years ago I was working with a director who was giving a health and safety briefing to his troops. And whilst he was giving the presentation, he was really great, open, confident, body language, working the audience. He was fantastic, actually. When the time came for him to take questions from the floor, and there were some quite robust and challenging questions, it all started to unravel. His body language went from confident and working the audience to uncomfortable and, well, looking as though he didn't really want to be there in front of everybody at that stage. Really important to be mindful of your body language. The thing is, you might be feeling terrified at the question. You might be thinking to yourself, I have no idea how I'm going to respond to this. Nobody will know if you are standing in the right way. If you look like this. Read books on body language and look specifically at evaluation gestures and gestures that show that you're listening to somebody. And make sure that you've got a default question-taking posture that creates a positive impression that you're listening to the person who's asking the question and evaluating what they say, and not revealing the fact that you feel like a rabbit in the headlights. We've all been there. Just a word of advice. The second thing is with regard to your tone of voice. Again, I've covered that in another 5-minute masterclass. The important thing is when we start to feel under pressure and nervous, we start to breathe in a shallow way, our throat gets dry, our voices go up, and people can hear the anxiety in our voice. Make sure that your tone of voice remains level and neutral. Not monotonous, but level and neutral. So those things are prerequisites, basically, to taking the questions. Make sure you are in the right mindset. You do know more than your audience, and make sure you're prepared. Be very mindful of your body language and tone. And now to those 3 specific techniques. The repeat, the deflect and the flannel. Now, these can be used one after the other. Now, the thing is, if you're prepared and you know your material, you will be able to think of something to say. Sometimes it's a question of buying time to just come up with the right response at the right time, and that's all you're doing, buying a few moments to think. So, the repeat. This is actually quite a useful technique if you're in a large room of people. Somebody from over there, let's say, has asked a question, and you're thinking to yourself, I haven't got a clue how I'm going to respond to that. The person finishes their question and you say something like, that's a very interesting question. For the benefit of anybody who didn't hear over this side of the room, the key issue was, and you repeat the question, preferably in your own words. Now, what you're doing there is actually quite usefully making sure everybody did hear the question. You are buying yourself a few seconds to think of that response. Now, it's fine if you're in a huge room and you can do that. Somebody over there might not have heard. Less useful if you're in a meeting room that's like this big and everybody's going to have heard. In which case, tailor that technique slightly and listen reflectively. You can easily say something like, so in the interest of clarity, what you're actually wanting to know is, and repeat the question in your own words. Again, it's clarifying that you are about to answer the right question, which is always useful, and you're buying yourself a few moments. Oftentimes that's enough for your brain to sift through the information files and come up with the right response. If not, a second technique that you can try is the deflect. Now, I've seen some of my colleagues do this so well, it is practically an art form. Let's imagine that the person has asked a question, you've repeated it, and you're still not quite sure what you're going to say in response. You can deflect and say something like, well, I do have some thoughts on that. Actually, I don't. I'm just saying that. I do have some thoughts on that, but before I jump in with my own responses, what does anybody else think? And you pause for a few moments. Now, two things here. One, you are giving yourself a few moments to think of a response. Two, you are ascertaining if anybody else in the room has knowledge of this. That's going to be useful in a minute. Three, in all probability, somebody will say something, which gives you the opportunity to piggyback your answer on what they have just said. Now, let's imagine there's a horrible tumbleweed moment and nobody actually says anything. That is telling you that actually nobody knows the answer to this. So it's almost going to be okay if you don't have a ready response. In which case you can go back to the speaker and say, well, clearly this is a complex issue. May I ask, do you have any thoughts on this? And maybe they do. Maybe they will kickstart their own discussion. Maybe they'll turn around and say, well, actually, no, I don't. That's why I was asking you. In which case you already know, if they don't know, nobody else has had anything to say. Actually, it's not going to be so heinous a crime if you don't have a ready answer. Quite an important factor, because that allows you to move on to the third of these three techniques, the flannel. With the flannel, what you're doing essentially is saying something actually without saying anything at all. So, in our little scenario there, it might be something like, well, that's a very interesting point and I'm glad you've raised it at this juncture. The fact actually that nobody else has any comments to make here is indicative of the complexity of this particular issue. Rather than just coming off with my off-the-cuff remarks, I think it's worthwhile looking into this a little bit more deeply, etc., etc. What you are doing is actually not revealing an answer, but you are talking in a confident and competent way that retains your persona and your authority to be on the stage as a speaker. Find your own form of words. Obviously, don't just repeat what I'm saying here. You're saying something without saying anything. That particular scenario, again, if still you have nothing to say, really by this point you will have thought of something, but if you don't, and your brains have just kind of run out the door somehow, then the question then is, and how do I say, actually I don't know, without being apologetic and whilst still remaining your gravitas and your authority as the speaker? In that instance, as I say, you're fairly certain that if nobody else knows and you don't know, then actually it can become a joint learning process. That's a really interesting point. It's a very complex issue. Rather than coming in with my own response just now, I would like to be able to look into this further and get back to you all. Would that be okay? It might be after the end of this workshop. You are saying, I don't know, but I will find out and get back to you. It's also worth questioning in your own mind, well, why don't I know? Should I really have prepared a little bit more? In which case, that type of flanneling, as it were, might well buy you enough time, or it should buy you enough time to think of a suitable response. What if it's a new piece of information? Well, you're quite at liberty to say so, maintaining your body language and your tone of voice. I wasn't aware of that. When did that information come to light? Oh, it was on the news this morning. I didn't have an opportunity to hear that. I'd like to. Maybe we can catch up during the break and find a form of words that's comfortable for you and use that. Be very aware of your body language and your tone of voice. Those in essence are the three techniques: the repeat, the deflect and the flannel. If you don't know, find a form of words, find a tone of voice and a posture that will allow you to say, I don't know, whilst still retaining your authority as a speaker. Don't guess, because you'll look like an idiot if you get it wrong. Don't lie, because that will do you no favours in the long term. And don't do what politicians do and answer a different question completely, because we can all see through that. So, I hope that this has been useful for you. Remember, the critical prerequisites are the mindset. Tell yourself that you know more than your audience and make sure you're prepared. Be very, very aware of your body language and your tone of voice. And those three techniques, the repeat, the deflect and the flannel.